roughly speaking, I suppose you could think about being as what is currently and becoming as how that's going to transform. But it's more than how it's going to transform too, because it's also how it should transform. And it seems to me that when you're wrestling with the fundamental questions of your life, you have to wrestle with both of those propositions. You have to figure out what it is that's here and now, and where you are, and what you are. And then you have to figure out what you're going to do about that. And hypothetically, at least in principle, it seems like people are generally motivated to attempt to make it better. And so then you have to figure out what constitutes better, and then that also means that you are instantly into the domain of values. And not only is there an impetus to make it better, but there's also the fact that while you're trying to make things better, you're also fighting against entropy itself, the tendency of complicated things to fall apart, or complex things to fall apart. And so it requires energy to make things better. It even requires energy just to keep things the way they are. So in some sense, life is an uphill battle, because you're pushing against great forces that act in opposition to your existence. And I suppose in some sense that's the fundamental basis of existential thinking, which is a form of thinking that I'm also fond of, because the existentialists make the claim that existence itself is a problem, and so that means that in some sense psychopathology is built right into the nature of human existence. And it's partly because we're limited and we suffer because of that, and the flip side of that is, well, we're limited and we're working against forces that are in many ways greater than we are and that are pushing in the opposite direction. So not life is being and becoming, and it's also the problem of being and becoming, and that's what you're stuck with. And it's kind of useful to know what you're stuck with, I think, because it stops you from being isolated, because everybody's also stuck with that. It also makes you understand that if you have a problem, that doesn't necessarily mean there's something wrong with you. It's just that you're alive, and that's a problem. And, you know, of course that can get so complicated that it's unbearable. But the central, like, you know, people think in some sense, or people are inclined to think that if life was operating optimally, you'd be happy or something like that. And I think that that's an unreasonable hope in some ways, because life itself is so complicated because of its fundamental essence, that the idea that you can exist in some optimized state on a constant basis is, well, it's just, that's just not how it is. So you have to, when you mature and when you become wiser, you have to take into account what the actual limitations are, and then you have to figure out a way that you can exist, not so much despite that, but while taking that into account. And it seems to me that it's possible to do that. You know, one idea is that you can hide from that. I think the idea of positive illusions is like that, you know, you need to construct defenses against the nature of the world. Terror management theory posits that as well. You know, the sort of idea is that life itself is so terrible that you have to build defenses against it, and some of those defenses have the nature of positive illusions. But I don't buy that. I think that people are tough. They're a lot tougher than they think. And so I think that people are capable of facing up to reality, even though reality as it's experienced is fundamentally tragic. That's tragic because people are limited. So that's sort of the domain that you're in. And I think that for psychology to be something that's profound, it can't skirt those issues. It has to address them directly. And that's difficult because they're not merely objective problems. They're also subjective problems. And it isn't all that obvious how science can deal with subjective problems. But we're not dealing with science in psychology. We're dealing with human being in the phenomenological sense. And so at least that's how it looks to me. And so